everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We're constantly scanning the horizon for any developments that could impact the Turkish Cypriot community. And, well, this time, we've stumbled upon something pretty concerning.
Yeah, this isn't just another news cycle blip. We're talking about potential shifts in the geopolitical landscape that could have long-term consequences.
Right, and it all stems from this analysis we found on YouTube. It's a video by İlay Aksoy.
And the content really lives up to it. We're going to break down the key points for you today, but just to give you a taste, the central theme is about how the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, the TRNC, is being increasingly sidelined on the world stage.
And that sidelining, they argue, is happening because of some, let's say, questionable moves in Turkish foreign policy.
Exactly. And to really grasp the weight of this argument, we need to zoom in on a specific event.
The Samarkand Climate Summit, held just recently on April 4th and 5th.
Hosted by the president of Uzbekistan, no less. This wasn't some small gathering either.
Oh no, this is the big leagues. We're talking UN officials, EU representatives, major financial institutions, environmental ministers from all over.
The whole shebang.
Exactly. Now, here's the kicker, and this is where the alarm bells started ringing for us. Turkey, nowhere to be seen.
Not invited, no representative, not even an observer, totally absent.
And that, my friends, is the million-dollar question we're going to unpack today. Why is Turkey, a major regional power, missing from a climate summit in Central Asia? And what does this tell us about the situation in Northern Cyprus?
Because let me tell you, the connections are deeper than you might think.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. The YouTube analysis claims that Northern Cyprus is being disregarded, flat out. What's the basis for such a strong statement?
Well, they put the blame squarely on what they see as failures in Turkish foreign policy, specifically under the AK party government. And they don't let the opposition off the hook either. They say they haven't done enough to counter this.
So a lack of ownership, basically.
Exactly. They're arguing that Ankara isn't stepping up to the plate and really fighting for the TRNC's interests on the world stage. Not with enough consistency or forcefulness, anyway.
And this takes us right back to the Samarkand Summit. It was billed as a climate summit, all about tackling that global crisis. But our source, they're saying there was more to it than met the eye.
Oh, definitely. They believe the EU had their own agenda simmering beneath the surface. Geopolitics, plain and simple.
Interesting. So spell it out for us. What were these supposed hidden objectives?
The way they see it, the EU was looking to flex its muscles a bit. Develop a new strategy to counter Russian influence in Central Asia, for one. And a big part of that was pushing this trans-Caspian transport route. They call it the Middle Corridor, basically an alternative route that bypasses Russia altogether.
Makes sense strategically, especially given the, well, current climate.
Absolutely. And then there's the Ukraine war. Nobody knows for sure how that's going to end, but the EU's already thinking ahead, trying to secure their supply of natural resources from sources they see as more stable.
Diversifying their portfolio, so to speak. Makes sense. But then, our source throws this curveball. This is the part that really got us thinking.
Oh yeah, the claim that the EU basically used Northern Cyprus as a bargaining chip.
They said the EU put Northern Cyprus on the table.
Exactly. And they claim this was done with the UN's blessing and, get this, to bolster Israel's position in the region. It all points to a much bigger and more intricate game being played here.
That's a huge claim. So how did this alleged bargaining chip play out in actual discussions, in concrete actions?
Well, remember that massive 12 billion euro support package that EU President Ursula von der Leyen announced?
For those 5 Central Asian countries, right?
Yeah, you got it. Now, on the surface, this looks like just good old development aid, investment in the region.
But as they say, the devil is in the details. How exactly was all that money divvied up?
Well, according to our source, and this is where things get interesting, the breakdown's quite revealing. 2.5 billion was earmarked for mining and mineral extraction in those 5 countries. Another 3 billion to develop the Middle Corridor. Getting those minerals to Europe and improving the transport links with China. Then a whopping 6.4 billion for water, energy, climate change, and environmental protection. And finally, a relatively smaller 100 million for digital infrastructure development.
So yeah, substantial financial commitment. But our source is viewing this generosity with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Oh, definitely. They're pretty much saying, don't be fooled. They see these kinds of massive aid packages as potential precursors to instability. The argument is that this wasn't just a free lunch. There were strings attached. A quid pro quo.
And what exactly did these Central Asian countries have to give up in exchange for this European generosity?
This is where Cyprus comes back into play, and it gets a little murky. The source claims a strong Greek Cypriot-Israeli lobby was working behind the scenes, leveraging Greece and Cyprus's veto power within the EU. They pressured these 5 countries to take some pretty concrete actions.
Like what?
Well, first, recognize the Republic of Cyprus as the only legitimate state on the island, then acknowledge its territorial integrity, appoint ambassadors to southern Cyprus, and this is a big one, explicitly recognize Turkey as an occupying power in northern Cyprus. Oh, and agree that northern Cyprus wouldn't get any further international recognition and would be blocked from becoming a full member of the Organization of Turkic States.
Wow, that's a whole lot to swallow. And our source claims these demands had immediate consequences.
Oh, yeah. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, they all reportedly appointed ambassadors to southern Cyprus, like right away. And that's a pretty big deal because it directly undermines the observer status that northern Cyprus had managed to secure in the Organization of Turkic States just a few years ago. It really shows you the potential impact of this pressure.
So, while all this diplomatic wrangling was going on, what was Turkey's response to all of this? Our source doesn't paint a very flattering picture, do they?
No, not at all. They're pretty scathing, actually. They accuse the AK party government of completely dropping the ball, failing to come up with any kind of effective counter strategy to protect northern Cyprus from this mounting pressure. And get this, they say that instead of tackling the issue head on, the government is trying to distract everyone by playing up this headscarf victim narrative in Cyprus.
That's quite a serious accusation. But then our source also pushes back on that narrative, highlighting what they see as the unique identity and values of Turkish Cypriots.
Right, right. They make a point of saying that Turkish Cypriots are a very patriotic bunch. They're fiercely supportive of their own state, they're religious, but they're also committed to a secular state, just like Ataturk envisioned. And they highlight all the sacrifices Turkish Cypriots have made throughout history to maintain their presence on the island.
It's like they're saying, don't underestimate us.
Exactly. They're saying, don't think you can just throw us a bone and expect us to forget about the bigger picture, about our fundamental rights and our future.
All right, now let's take a step back, zoom out a bit, and look at the bigger geopolitical picture like our source does. How does Turkey's heavy involvement in other regional hotspots like Syria play into this whole situation?
Well, our source argues that Turkey's laser focus on the Syrian conflict, and let's not forget the friction that's caused with Israel, has weakened their position in other areas, including Cyprus. They actually bring up a past statement from the Turkish foreign minister where he openly acknowledges Turkey's been deeply involved in the Syrian war right from the start.
And they seem to be suggesting an alternative path Turkey could have taken.
Exactly. They argue that if Turkey had poured all that energy, all that diplomatic capital into pushing for Cyprus's recognition over the last 14 years, instead of getting so entangled in Syria, things might look very different for both Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots today.
And they don't sugarcoat their assessment of the consequences of Turkey's Syrian policy.
Not at all. They list out a whole bunch of negative outcomes. Things like the YPG, the Kurdish People's Protection Units in Syria, expanding their territory. And then there's HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this jihadist group, becoming a de facto partner of the state in some areas. They talk about Israel stepping up their military presence near Damascus, about a border region with Turkey being controlled by groups considered terrorist organizations, and the massive headache of trying to repatriate all those Syrian refugees. But the real point they're driving at is that the EU, they seized the opportunity. They saw Turkey getting bogged down, getting weaker because of Syria, and they pounced, using it to push their own agenda in Cyprus.
So basically, the Samarkand summit wasn't just about climate change or even about pushing back against Russia. It was a whole lot more complicated than that. And Cyprus got caught in the crossfire.
That's exactly it. Our source argues that the EU was playing a multi-level game here. On one hand, they're trying to gain a strategic upper hand in Cyprus to benefit the Greek Cypriots. But on the other, they're making a big power play against Russia, trying to cut them and Belarus out of this crucial middle corridor transport route.
So can you break down this transport route shift for us? What's Turkey's role in all of this? Or rather, how does the analysis view Turkey's limited say in this change?
Sure. So before the Ukraine war, the plan was for the middle corridor to run from China through Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, Poland, and then on to Germany. But the new route, the one they're pushing with this 12 billion euro package, it swings south. It goes from China through Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, then Turkey, and finally Bulgaria. So Turkey's on the map geographically, but our source is saying, look closer. They argue that Turkey doesn't really have much control over this change. They're basically a transit point, not a key player.
And Belarus getting booted from this route, that seems pretty significant too. It's tied up with these wider tensions, particularly between Poland and the EU.
The analysis is very clear on this. They blame Belarus's exclusion directly on Poland. You see, Poland shares a border with Belarus. And the analysis paints Poland as wanting a bigger slice of the EU's defense budget, so they have a vested interest in keeping things tense on that border. They even mention this incident where a truck in Belarus loaded with explosives was intercepted. Apparently, it was meant for some kind of terrorist attack in Russia. It just goes to show how high the stakes are in the region right now.
Right. Now, beyond all this geopolitical maneuvering, our source also points to some pretty strong economic motivations driving the EU's engagement in Central Asia.
Yeah, they're arguing that the EU is thinking long term. They know the war in Ukraine won't last forever, so they're scrambling to find other sources for those essential natural resources. Historically, Ukraine's been a big supplier of various minerals.
Right.
But Central Asia, it's sitting on a gold mine, literally. They've got huge reserves of things like titanium, lead, chromium. The source even throws in some hard data to back it up. They're talking globally significant percentages here.
So the EU sees Central Asia as the next big supplier for these vital resources. But it sounds like their strategy goes beyond just throwing money at the problem.
Oh, definitely. Our source suggests they're trying to, how to put this delicately, destabilize the region a bit. These Central Asian countries, they've historically been in Russia's orbit. So the EU's trying to use trade and economic leverage to weaken Russia's grip and hopefully get a better deal on these resources for themselves.
But our source seems a bit doubtful about this whole destabilization plan.
Yeah, they're not buying it entirely. They point out that even though these 5 Central Asian nations broke away from Russia back in 1991, Russia's influence is still deeply ingrained, especially in their security and economic systems. They're saying it's going to be really tough for the EU to just waltz in and knock Russia off its perch.
Makes you wonder about those long-term consequences we mentioned.
Yeah, it's a real chess match.
Now, there's one last piece of the puzzle our source explores, and it might explain why these Turkic states seem to be playing ball with the EU, even with Turkey out of the picture and clearly not on board. It all comes down to political ideologies.
Right. It's an interesting point they raise. They highlight the fact that in all 5 of those Turkic states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, the Muslim Brotherhood is a no-go. It's banned, labeled a terrorist organization. And they suggest that the AK party's perceived closeness to the Muslim Brotherhood, their support for some groups in Syria that are seen as linked to al-Qaeda, it's making these other Turkic states nervous. Doesn't help that they haven't consistently backed secular forces either. It feeds into this perception that they might pose a security risk down the line.
So it's not just about economic interests.
Yeah.
There's some deep-seated ideological differences at play here, too.
Exactly. It's not a simple equation.
And then there's this whole issue of migration between Central Asia and Turkey.
Yeah, the source mentions that too. They talk about how a lot of people from these Central Asian countries are coming into Turkey, both legally and illegally. They single out Tajikistan, saying they're really cracking down on radical jihadist groups within their own borders. So it's clear that these countries have their own security concerns, and those concerns are probably influencing their reluctance to fully align themselves with Turkey's current foreign policy, at least as they perceive it.
It's a tangled web, that's for sure. So let's bring it all together. What's the main takeaway, the overarching argument that our source is putting forward?
The big picture is this. They're saying that Turkey's foreign policy decisions, particularly their heavy involvement in Syria and the resulting tensions with Israel, have left them exposed on other fronts. And the EU, they're exploiting that weakness, using the Cyprus issue as leverage in this big geopolitical power game. And who's caught in the middle? The Turkish Cypriot people. They're the ones paying the price. And the source is pretty pessimistic. They think it's going to be really tough for Turkey to turn the ship around. They even criticize what they see as a focus on perception management instead of addressing the real fundamental issues facing northern Cyprus.
It's a sobering analysis, that's for sure. So for our listeners, the big takeaway is this. There are some serious shifts happening in the international arena. And those shifts are having a real impact on the status of northern Cyprus. And it's not happening in a vacuum. It's all tied up with these broader power plays and some, shall we say, questionable decisions being made in Ankara.
It all begs a pretty important question. What does the future hold for the Turkish Cypriot people? They have legitimate aspirations for international recognition and security. But given all this complexity, all these competing interests swirling around them, What are their chances? It's something we all need to think about, to really grapple with. The stakes are high.
Couldn't agree more. And for those of you who want to learn more about the Turkish Cypriot cause, to really understand the nuances of the situation, and maybe even lend your support, we encourage you to check out TCE. That's TC Exists. They're an NGO based in the UK, and they're dedicated to advocating for the rights and recognition of Turkish Cypriots. You can find them online at www.tcexist.com. They're doing some fantastic work making sure the voice of Turkish Cypriots isn't drowned out in all this noise.
It's more important than ever to stay informed and engaged.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more insights and analysis on the issues that matter most to the Turkish Cypriot community.